Hi, and welcome to When Multicultural Isn't Enough, Cultural Humility and Supervision. I'm Dana Sia, pronouns she, they. Just an opportunity to ground in. You don't have to take it. I'm going to. I know we can get really busy. I don't know where you're coming from or where you're headed after this. So here's an opportunity to ground into this moment and what we're about to talk about. So for me, I'm going to take a deep breath in and a deep breath out. If that felt good, maybe go for one or two more. Also, just an opportunity to minimize any distractions you may have. For me, this looks like closing lots of tabs on my computer, as well as turning off or silencing my phone. So always a good reminder for me too, at this point in the presentation, make sure I have that turned off. My grandma is very good at calling me during presentations. So who am I? Why am I talking about this? I'm Dana Sia, pronouns she, they. I was a prior supervisee. I think that is an important context to have for anything related to supervision, to remember what it was like to be a supervisee. And for me as well, to remember what it was like for multicultural topics to come up regarding maybe clients that I had, or differences between me and my supervisor, or even me and my other like supervisees, my peers, things of that nature. I'm also a mental health clinician. I'm a professor. I teach in a clinical rehabilitation program. So I'm also a certified rehabilitation counselor. And I've been a supervisor for more than 60 individuals, not at all together at one point or another. I've had the opportunity to supervise master's students, Ph.D. students, as well as folks who are seeking their license. I really enjoy being a supervisor, and a key part of supervision for me has always been how to incorporate aspects of culture, specifically multicultural aspects related to the intersection of different cultural identities. We're going to get into all of that, but over time, I've really realized what we want to focus on, not just for multicultural aspects, but talking about cultural humility. And the CRCC just came out with their updated code of ethics, and there's a lot of focus on cultural humility. So I'll give you the definition. I'll talk about where it's at in the code of ethics, specifically related to supervision as well. We'll talk about incorporating cultural humility into supervision with some activities that you can use. These are activities that I personally have used as well. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about how you can assess your own cultural humility, as well as help supervisees to assess their own or to get their cultural humility assessed in some way. So we're going to start by talking about cultural competencies. And there's a little bit of a history here for cultural competencies. So this actually starts in 1992 when the kind of first version, if you will, of the multicultural counseling competencies was published. And the original authors were, and they say this in their article, they were primarily focused on race. So they were really writing this article or writing this information for white counselors who were counseling BIPOC clients, so Black, Indigenous, people of color clients. They were really focusing on white counselors who are working with BIPOC clients. That is what the focus of this first version of multicultural counseling competencies was. And specifically, they noted within the competencies, mostly cognitive abilities. So related to awareness, understanding, and developing different skills, knowledge, beliefs, and attitudes. So it wasn't really talking about applying anything, which we'll also get into. This was just about cognitive abilities of those counselors as they were working with clients. Then in 1996, one of the authors took it a step further to try to operationalize essentially the original competencies. Again, this is still focused on white counselors who are counseling BIPOC clients, and they were noting the Explanatory statements is what they basically added to the competencies. And if you look at these statements, they kind of come across as like a checklist of actions. One of them was that you can recognize and discuss the client's families and culture's perspective of acceptable, so normal, codes of conduct, and what are unacceptable or abnormal, and how this may or not vary from those of other cultures and families. So again, we're talking about primarily cognitive abilities, and it's saying, can you do this? Yes or no? If yes, check this off. So they were trying to put some sort of information for counselors on how to do it, right? They're talking about action here. It's still not really talking about an application though, and it's still focusing mostly on those cognitive abilities. So now we've got the most up to date, so to speak, from 2015, the Multicultural and Social Justice Counseling Competencies. And this was really a framework that they created. It has a visual aid, it's a praxis. So I'll show that in a slide or two, showing you kind of, they called it as a visual map, showing the relationship between the counselor and the client, and how the different competencies might apply to that relationship with regard to the dynamics around power and privilege, again, within the relationship. So that is essentially 4 different quadrants that we're talking about with relation to power and privilege, because they are separating out privilege and marginalized identities for the client, and then privilege and marginalized identities for the counselor, and looking at how those intersect and what we need to essentially do about it, if you will. So I've got on the screen here the Multicultural Social Justice Praxis. There's a lot going on, so don't feel like you have to memorize this or know it all by any means. Essentially, it kind of looks like a target or a bullseye. In the middle, there's a red circle. It says Multicultural and Social Justice Praxis in white letters. Out from there, there's an orange ring around that says Counselor Self-Awareness in black letters. Out from that is a light yellow ring that says Client Worldview in black letters. Then there's a green ring that says Counseling Relationship in black letters, and then a blue ring that says Counseling and Advocacy Interventions in black letters. On the outside of that, kind of framing it, it kind of creates almost like another circle of sorts, are the different words kind of pointing to each other, almost showing like a relationship from attitudes and beliefs to knowledge to skills and then to action. So that's at the very end, essentially saying, okay, we start in the middle with counselor self-awareness, then we move out to client worldview, then counseling relationship, then counseling and advocacy interventions. And on the outside, kind of keeping us all held together, are the attitudes and beliefs, knowledge, skills, and action. So on the top and bottom of the circle, in the very middle, at the very top is privileged counselor, at the very bottom is marginalized counselor, and then on the left and right hand side, again in the middle, left hand side is privileged client, and on the right hand side is marginalized client. And those are really not talking about individual counselors or individual clients. Those are talking about the different privileged and marginalized identities that we each have as counselors and or clients. So the domains are those inner rings of differing colors, and they know that these are supposed to be developmental. They are progressive levels of multicultural and social justice competence. So I'm going to kind of zoom in, if you will. I've got a few boxes that are going to highlight, which we're supposed to highlight when I was talking about it, but now we've got some boxes highlighting the privilege counselor, marginalized counselor, privileged client, marginalized client. And then I'll show you, I've just zoomed into one of the quadrants so we can really focus on those different inside rings, the colored rings, which are the domains. So again, these are developmental. They do build from the inside out. They're progressive. And these are the different levels of multicultural and social justice competence per the authors. So the first inside circle, essentially saying we start with counselor self-awareness. This is being able to identify our own cultural views, our views, our values, our beliefs, our biases. This is our ability to really have insights into ourselves. The next ring out is client worldview. So this is where we are cognizant of the client's cultural views, beliefs, values, biases. And so we can better understand their worldviews, their identity development. The next step is counseling relationships. So this would be important to know who we are, who the client is, to then be able to focus on the counseling relationship. What is going to influence that between the two of us? Where do we maybe share identities, or where do we have different identities? What sort of privilege or marginalized statuses do we have? And one that's always going to be there is that as counselors, we always hold a privileged space within that relationship, and the client is holding a marginalized status in that relationship. So just kind of keep that in mind as well. But that doesn't mean that that's across the board 100%, right? There are different ways that we may be privileged or marginalized as a person. We hold different aspects of ourselves, as does the client. So all that to say, it goes into the counseling relationship, which then should influence how we pick the counseling and advocacy interventions, which is that most outside layer. And this is hopefully going to be like evidence-based treatment interventions. What is going to work, and how do we know if it's going to work if we don't know who the client is and what they're bringing? When we have that self-awareness, we're attuned to their worldview, we're cognizant of how this shapes the counseling relationship, then we are best equipped to respond to the client's needs. Now we're talking about the competencies, which are at the very end, the attitudes and beliefs, knowledge, skills, and action, that outside kind of circle that was holding us all together, so to speak. Just kind of noting here that we'll talk a little bit about the word competence, because it does kind of sound like it's part of that checklist, right? Where you're done at some point. You've got it, you understand it. They do note, the authors, that it is supposed to be a constant state of developing these things so that you can be the most effective in your work with clients. However, again, competence kind of notes as if it's like, done at some point. But attitudes and beliefs, they are talking about the awareness of values, beliefs, and biases that we have about ourselves and our clients. So they are kind of ingrained into the different domains that we've already talked about. Knowledge is around being well informed on the complexities regarding counselor and client identity development, worldview, the nuances of culture, and the positive and negative effects of those privileged and marginalized statuses that we hold. I think that rehab counselors are sometimes even better prepared than some of the other helping professions, because this is a core component of our training, and what we do is having that particular type of knowledge. It is at the base of everything we do. Skills are around our abilities to really tailor the interventions that we use to align with the cultural worldview of the client. So we want to make sure, and this is going to go, if you think way back, if it's been a while since you were in school, to using research and taking trainings to figure out which interventions are appropriate for different clients. And some of it is not going to be perfect, right? Like you can't go to a training and they're not going to say, oh, well, you have this client, this is going to be perfect. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. So some of it is going to be using your clinical judgment and applying that. But really, they're talking about the skill to be able to navigate tailoring those interventions. So maybe you use an intervention or start with an intervention you thought was going to be helpful and it wasn't. Okay, so what skill do you have to kind of adjust course there? And then action at the very end is really about taking steps to operationalize the attitudes and beliefs, knowledge and skills. So, being able to do something about them. It's not enough if we don't operationalize them. And that comes back to that last update to the very first competencies where they kind of created that checklist of what you can do. In the article around this particular praxis, they also have kind of a checklist of if you can do this, you have met this area. So that's more of what they're talking about with action. The question, though, is it cultural competence that we are aiming for, or is it humility, cultural humility, maybe that we're going for? And if we're looking at the Commission on Rehabilitation Counselor Certification, CRCC, and their most updated code of ethics, what we should be heading towards is cultural humility. So cultural competence, again, I briefly mentioned this, it does give the impression that at some point we can say, hey, I'm competent, I'm good to go, and that there's some sort of end to our learning. And we know that's not true. In the 2023 Code of Professional Ethics for Certified Rehabilitation Counselors, it is noted in the definition of cultural humility that this is a lifelong process. So those are two very different things. Competence, saying, I'm competent, I'm good, check. And cultural humility saying, nope, this is a lifelong process and it never ends. So let's look at the definition of cultural humility from CRCC. As I mentioned, it says a lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique. I'm just going to start with that first line. This relates back to what the praxis emphasized and that very centering around starting with ourselves, right? So not the lifelong process part, but the self-reflection and self-critique part on that counselor self-awareness. The next line, whereby the individual not only learns about another's culture, but starts with an examination of their own beliefs and cultural identities. Again, coming back to counselor self-awareness. The key here is that lifelong process that is happening rather than that one competence checklist that is happening. All these standards saying like, I meet this. No, it's a lifelong process. We're constantly reflecting. We're constantly critiquing and saying, what else can I do? What else can I change? I don't know about you. I am always learning stuff about myself. I am always, shifting in my beliefs and a little bit in like my values and trying to figure out how do I want to show up in the world? And so I don't think that we necessarily solidify that one day. I think there's always an opportunity to grow and change. So that is part of what this is saying, this cultural humility definition. I'll read it one more time and then go on to the next slide. Cultural humility is a lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique whereby the individual not only learns about another's culture, but starts with an examination of their own beliefs and cultural identities. So you can find cultural humility first and foremost in Section A of the Code of Ethics, the counseling relationship. It's in A2, respecting diversity, and then little a, respecting culture. So it notes that we demonstrate cultural humility and have respect for the cultural identity of clients. In developing and implementing culturally responsive rehabilitation strategies and treatment plans by providing and adapting interventions. That's what I just talked about, right? With being able to shift as needed if we're finding that, like, this intervention isn't working, or maybe we need to learn new interventions to use with clients. Essentially, we are demonstrating the cultural humility first and foremost, and then also respecting the cultural identity of clients as we develop and implement culturally responsive strategies and treatment plans. And part of that requires us to provide and adapt interventions. It's also found in Section D, Multicultural Considerations, and it's in D3, Personal and Professional Development and Cultural Competence, and little d, Cultural Humility. So that's probably not a surprise it would show up there. We use cultural humility as an approach to address imbalance in client-provider power dynamics that include an openness to consider other perspectives. So this also comes back to some of what the praxis said around those privileged and marginalized identities. So knowing first and foremost that the power dynamic is there, that there is going to be an imbalance no matter what, no matter who we are as counselors, who they are as clients, there is a power imbalance. So we've got to be able to address that, as it says here, with cultural humility. And that requires us also to have an openness in considering other perspectives. Maybe what we think is the right thing to do or the right way to move forward isn't necessarily the right way for the particular person we're working with. Even though it's worked for like the last 122 people that we worked with, this 123rd person, it's just not it. We've got to do something else. Section I, and this is what we're talking about today, supervision, training, and teaching. This is found in I2, clinical supervisor competence, little b, multicultural and diversity issues in supervision. So it notes that supervisors are sensitive to the role of multiculturalism and diversity in their supervisory relationships with supervisees. This is just the first sentence related to this. So first and foremost, we are sensitive to the role of multiculturalism and diversity in our relationships with supervisees. Are we even cognizant that that's a thing? Are we paying attention to that? Are we acknowledging that, not, with ourselves before we even enter the relationship? And then also, we understand and use multiculturally sensitive and competent supervision practices. Have you really studied any supervision practices in a while? If your training was a long time ago, what have you researched since then? If you didn't really receive any formal training, what sort of training did you get? And maybe what sort of training do you need or do you want? Consider how you are incorporating multicultural aspects of supervision practices. It notes here that they are sensitive and competent. How do we know that they are working? We've got some research around this that I'll be presenting later around how cultural humility can improve our relationship. The problem is if we're not aware of it and we're not using it, then how can it improve our relationship and what we're doing? And then we also have that we are assisting supervisees, and I have this in italics. We are assisting supervisees in gaining knowledge, personal awareness, sensitivity, dispositions, and skills necessary for developing cultural humility. So it's not enough that we are aware of multicultural aspects around supervision. We also need to be ready to assist our supervisees in gaining the knowledge, personal awareness, sensitivity, dispositions, and skills necessary for developing their own cultural humility. Are you assessing for cultural humility with your supervisees? If you're not, don't worry. I've got some assessments towards the end that you can use with your supervisees. And if you haven't assessed for your own cultural humility, I have one of those too. But we are assisting supervisees in this. We're not assuming that they're coming in with it. And if there are gaps, we're not assuming that they're going to fix it on their own or that this is a problem such that they can't move forward at all. We know that this is a potential problem for anyone. So how can we assist them? Then the last bit here, that supervisors identify and address any gaps in multicultural knowledge or skills that could impede the supervisee relationship or learning experience. How do you know if there's any gaps if you aren't assessing it? What do you do once you find out there's gaps? I have some activities on how you can identify gaps and some thoughts at the end on what to do about the gaps. But we've got some learning experiences too that we'll talk about. This can sound, this is a lot. This is just like what, 4 sentences about our responsibility regarding cultural humility and supervision. However, those 4 sentences are carrying a lot for us to do in supervision. So I don't personally, as a supervisor, take this very lightly, and I hope you don't either. That's probably why you're here. Either because you don't take it lightly or you don't want to and you want to learn how to improve. So I hope that this information today will help you to meet these different aspects of what we are, as the Code of Ethics says, we are required to do as CRCC or CRC supervisors. So what are some of the benefits of cultural humility and supervision? If I haven't sold you yet, if the Code of Ethics isn't enough of a reason to bring in cultural humility, what are some of the benefits of cultural humility and supervision? So first, just know that when a supervisee perceives their supervisor to have cultural humility, supervisees are more open and disclose more. This is going to be super helpful for us. How else can we assess them and help them if they aren't open with us, if they don't disclose what's going on with them in their work? Supervisees view the supervisory relationship more favorably. Hopefully this means they're getting more out of it, which means they're applying more outside of session, which means their clients are benefiting more too. Supervisees have a greater sense of counselor self-efficacy. So they feel like, I got this, because they feel supported by their supervisor, perhaps. And supervisees are more satisfied with supervision. So not only do they view it more favorably, not only do they feel more confident, they are also overall more satisfied with the supervision that they're receiving. So if you don't feel like the requirements in the codes are enough, I hope that these are good reasons for incorporating cultural humility yourself as a supervisor, because you are here, it's saying you're being perceived to have cultural humility. It's not about discussing cultural humility in session. That's not enough. It's you having cultural humility, and then these things happen. So in the research, kind of what they were noting here and what I've alluded to is that having cultural humility as a supervisor essentially led to a stronger working alliance, which also led to better supervision outcomes. Better supervision outcomes in this case was related to supervision satisfaction. For me, though, supervision outcomes, the best supervision outcomes would be better client outcomes. And I think if we were to take this a step further, if we were to do some more research on this, that you would probably find that too. They did, in the same article, actually, they did find that cultural humility from the counselor's perspective led to a stronger relationship with the client, which then led to better client outcomes. So I'm hoping this is kind of like a trickle down effect, right? We're at the top as a supervisor. And if we have cultural humility, we are showing that in session, we are teaching that, assisting our supervisees with their cultural humility, then they can carry that into their own sessions, show their cultural humility. The client feels closer to them, can disclose more, is open more, is more satisfied, and has better results as well. I'm reaching a little bit because this research hasn't been confirmed, but it feels like that could happen, right? It feels like it would make sense to have happen. So we've got lots of information here, and the word action has come up quite a bit. But one word that hasn't come up is application. And there were a few researchers who had a little bit of a problem with that. They said action is not enough. We need to see application. So, what is application if not action? Application is knowledge, behavior, and action in the appropriate context. So it's having the knowledge, it's doing the thing, the behavior or the action in the appropriate context. So an example would be like shaking hands. There are different cultural norms around shaking hands. In different contexts, it may be appropriate to shake hands or not shake hands. You would have to have the knowledge of that before you get into that context to then use the behavior and the action, right? That's the application. Going in somewhere to a social setting and either shaking someone's hand or not shaking someone's hand, that action, that's not enough. That's not application because it's not really indicating any sort of knowledge or any sort of recognition around the context that you're in. Just having the knowledge around whether or not it would be appropriate to shake someone's hand in a setting. Or even, let's flip it around. Could you read someone's nonverbal body language and figure out if they were comfortable on shaking hands? With the pandemic, this changed a lot for us. And some folks are still very hesitant about shaking hands. Not that they weren't before, but even within a culture here in like North America, it's kind of assumed that you would shake hands as like a greeting or maybe you're leaving. During the pandemic, that was kind of like that stopped, right? For most people, it did. And even now, there are many people who are still hesitant to shake hands. So, you might be saying, all right, well, the pandemic is kind of lessened, it's quote over, it's not as much of a concern. So we're back to shaking hands. So the context is shaking hands equals good. The behavior action is I'm going to shake someone's hand. So you've got the knowledge that okay, pandemic's over, shaking of hands is okay, we're back on. Behavior action is shaking hands. You're in the context of someone who would usually be okay with shaking hands, and you go in for the shake. And then what happens? They don't really act like they want to shake your hand. Could you read that body language and recognize, like, oh, they're not comfortable? This isn't what I should do. Maybe, can you go for like, what's that like, brush your hair back to pretend you weren't doing that or whatever. Go for, to say, oh, wave, something like that. The hair thing was a joke. The wave is maybe more appropriate. Or just kind of put your hand by your side or something. Don't make a big deal about it. That's application. So it's pulling it all together, right? It's not just the action, it is pulling it all together. Why is application important? Without application, we run the risk of, within supervision, perceiving our supervisees negatively, perceiving supervisees' clients negatively. So with this handshaking situation, for example, if we went in to shake the hand of a supervisee, expecting that to be a very normal thing, like, hey, how are you? Nice to meet you. And they don't go to shake our hand, we're like, why isn't this person shaking my hand? I have my hand out, right? You're not applying that additional context and nonverbal behavior there. You might perceive that supervisee as like not friendly. Or maybe the client and the the supervisee and the client have a similar interaction, and you think the same thing. Like, why isn't the client shaking someone's hand? What's wrong with the client? Kind of jumping to conclusions, right? So we have the opportunity, unfortunately, to perceive others negatively, in this case, supervisees and their clients. We also run the risk of providing inadequate or harmful supervision. So inadequate is, as it sounds, it's not enough. We are not providing enough feedback. We are not meeting them enough. We are not supporting them in their cultural humility. Harmful, which some would argue that inadequate supervision is also harmful, but harmful is really like adding shame. It is keeping them from being able to move forward, not applying appropriate gatekeeping strategies, and then putting client welfare in jeopardy as well. All this trickles down to the client, right? If we're not supporting our supervisee, how can they support their client? If we're grading, so to speak, depending upon if it's a student, but even someone who's seeking their license, or if we have some sort of effect on their job, if we are grading them more negatively than maybe is appropriate, that might be harmful supervision. And we're doing it because we perceive them negatively. So it's kind of like it's bleeding over with our bias, if that makes sense. So what does application of cultural humility require of us? It requires cultural comfort. What is that? It's those feelings that occur before, during, and after culturally relevant conversations. So can we be comfortable in potentially uncomfortable situations? And if we're uncomfortable, can we maybe voice that and use our cultural humility? It also requires cultural opportunities. So these are times when culture is presented for consideration and we choose to act or not. So kind of like if the supervisee notes in session, hey, I went to shake my client's hand and they didn't shake mine. And we're like, oh, okay. We chose not to act on that. Instead of saying like, oh, okay, and then what happened? Or what do you think that was about? Or what kind of thoughts and feelings were you having in that moment, right? Like there's a million different questions or ways we could go with that. But if we ignore it completely, then we're missing that cultural opportunity. And we could be on purpose missing it because we're not comfortable. See how those go hand in hand? So we've got to have the comfort, which to some extent means we need to be confident in being able to address cultural opportunities. So maybe that's something we need to build up and practice. So how do we apply cultural humility in supervision? We focus on how cultural dynamics affect supervision. So where do as the supervisor, our cultural worldviews and the supervisee's cultural worldviews interact? Also, how does this interaction affect the formation and maintenance of our relationship? So if I am a handshaker and they're not a handshaker, and I expect a handshake every session, and they don't want to shake my hand, how's that going to work for us in being able to form and maintain our relationship? I know that that can feel like a pretty silly example. However, that can contribute to these. Focus on how cultural dynamics affect the supervision triad: supervisor, supervisee, and client, where supervisors, supervisees, and clients' cultural worldviews interact. So now you've got 3 different worldviews interacting. How does the interaction affect the functioning of supervision triad and evolution of the dynamics? Essentially, how does our relationship work? How does their relationship work? And how is that going to affect client welfare? So here's some examples of experiential activities so you can incorporate cultural humility into your sessions. And this is one I really enjoy. It's called salient activity, I think salient circles activity is usually what I call it, but the salient circles activity. And in this activity, you can do it in individual, you can do it in triadic or group supervision. Don't forget to join the activity. Use the supervisor with that cultural humility, please. For the group, I recommend using a think, pair, share type of experience when exploring the results of the activity, and I'll show you how to do that or kind of walk you through it. And this does work virtually or in person. I have done it both ways. So some materials you'll need for this, it's a little bit of a maybe artistic creative activity. You'll need some blank paper, or they could pull up like a Word document or like a note on your phone, anything that's basically blank, something that you can write on, draw on, or make textures on for folks who maybe have low visual acuity. You might consider some materials to draw with or make textures with. If you're in person, maybe bring those, kind of be prepared. Could be as simple as a pen. But if you do need something to create textures, maybe consider like pipe cleaners, or like drawing materials that have wax that kind of create like a texture on the surface. You could also cut shapes out of paper if you wanted to, so some different options there. These are the instructions that you're going to give. You're going to have the supervisees use circles, and you're going to note in the circles the different identities, specifically the most important, meaningful identities to you, to the supervisee, and of course you too, because you're doing this. The size and spacing of circles matters. So the more important the identity, the larger your circle will be. Any circles or identities that are related, they're going to overlap. And you can have as few or as many circles as you want. So you're creating a diagram essentially of your most important, meaningful identities. Each identity has its own circle, and each circle has a different size and different space on the paper. The size, the bigger it is, the more important it is. And as far as overlapping, those are related identities. And then each person can have as few or as many circles as they like. This is an example that comes from the original research article that I do share with participants. I show them this. So we've got different circles here, a large orange one on the left, it's all by itself. On the right-hand side, we have a brown one. It's kind of medium size at the top, and then in the middle, overlapping that is a green one, also a little bit larger than the medium size. Below that, overlapping the green one, is a pink one. That's the smallest circle yet. And then overlapping both the green and pink is a large, I think it looks like it's the largest circle. It's yellow. And I do have each of the identities marked out, and that is so that each supervisee really comes up with their own identities. They're not just like copying off of the original author. The timing for this, give like 2 to 5 minutes to create the circles, 1 to 2 minutes to reflect after they've created the circles. You can ask prompting questions like, what was this experience like? If you're in a group for the think, pair, share, the think is the reflection time. They're thinking on their own. Pair is where you'd pair them up with one other supervisee, and they'd have 5 minutes to share with each other. I always note that they can share as much or as little as they want to, and they always have the option to pass on any question they might get asked. And then really like overall, probably no more than 10 minutes for everyone. Just kind of keep an eye on the clock. You don't want it to go too long where you've lost everyone's interest, but you do want enough time so that folks can like share their thoughts. When I have the group come back from being paired up, I will have them share maybe similarities that they found in their pairs or differences. For me as a supervisor and facilitator, I will look for differences and similarities, and I will give kind of summaries of those and reflections of those. This is also a great activity for supervisees to use with their own clients. So don't forget to encourage your supervisees to then take this one step further and do it with the client. And wouldn't that be cool to then have the kind of triad of circles there? You've got yours, the supervisee has theirs, the client has theirs, and you're able to kind of compare and contrast. A cultural genogram and autobiography is another activity you can do. So it may be more appropriate for individual supervision because this can take quite a bit of time and energy. I think one consideration maybe to avoid some of the time that it might take is starting it in session, having the supervisee complete the work between sessions, and then bring their final work to the next session for y'all to discuss and process the results with them. This can work in person or virtually. So the materials you'll need, again, another like space to draw on, to write on. In the case, you could also use like voice to text, I think could be another option. And there's also some genogram websites. So it could be just as simple as plugging it into one of their diagrams rather than trying to create something from scratch. For the instructions here, having them write down the first names of their family members, maybe 2 or 3 generations back. A side note here on, cultural humility is this may not work for some individuals who aren't connected with their past generations in their family. So consider being flexible. Think through maybe with the supervisee on how to adjust this experience, this activity with them to better fit what would work for them. Maybe let them even know what the end result is supposed to be, which we'll get to in a second, so that they can maybe figure out the best way to go through this. Otherwise, you're having folks write down the first names of their family members 2 or 3 generations back, and then they describe the cultural background of each family member. And this can include and is not limited to gender, age, race, ethnicity, language, sexual orientation, religion, disability, economic status, socioeconomic status. So there's a lot of different aspects around their family members they could include. They also want to go one step further and work to identify the beliefs, attitudes, and values of their family of origin. And this could be different per person. And that's why I say it can take quite a while. So they may want to take it outside of session. Have supervisees reflect on the beliefs and attitudes and values of their families of origin, note where their own beliefs, attitudes, and values maybe match or differ, and encourage them to identify how this has contributed to their own negative or positive attitudes towards other cultural groups. This is what you would discuss when they come back and they've had some time. You can use this information to identify biases, discuss and explore them in supervision, and it may inform work that needs to be done, whether in supervision or outside of supervision, like trainings or experiential learning. Interpersonal process recall is one I really like too, and there is a way of applying a multicultural cultural humility lens to this. It's probably going to be most appropriate for individual or triadic supervision. Supervisees are thinking really deeply. They are sharing deeply. So that might be hindered by that group setting. This can work virtually or in person. I've done both. So the 4 main goals of interpersonal process recall generally are to increase awareness of covert thoughts or feelings. So thoughts or feelings supervisees may not be aware of. Practice expressing those thoughts and feelings in the here and now without feared consequences. So they're able to address them, use some of that cultural humility, that discomfort that we talked about earlier is probably going to come up, and discover how and where counselors fail to deal with clients' interpersonal messages and their own feelings. And that comes back to those cultural moments that might be missed. So we are helping to increase involvement with clients via immediacy. We get to see, this is based on tapes, we get to see what's going on with clients and learn a little bit more about them. So we can review the tape together, we stop at certain points and have the supervisee note what they were thinking and feeling in that moment. It is most helpful to have questions ready. I mean, truly, the success of this is dependent upon what questions you ask. So I have recommended a resource here where they have a table full of questions on all these different aspects around cultural, multicultural things that may come up in sessions. So affective, cognitive, body sensations, images, expectations, mutual perceptions, associations, unstated agendas, and ending. So maybe you're watching the session that's been recorded with a supervisee, and you notice something like the client shutting down, or you notice some sort of shift in energy. So you pause it and you say, "Hey, what were you thinking and feeling then?" And you've also got an idea of what the client said, so you can use some questions to gear it towards that as well. Again, I really think you don't need to recreate the wheel. You don't need to come at this from scratch. Use the questions that are already created that you already have access to. So, how do we assess cultural humility? We've got a few options. One, maybe most importantly, is having supervisees assess you for cultural humility. You can have them use a multicultural supervision inventory. At the very top, it has them fill out information about their background, as well as information around your supervision and your relationship. There are 5 different sections: attitudes and beliefs, knowledge and understanding, skills and practices, and relationship. I think that's 4. I think there's 5. I must have missed one. But there's 66 questions total, and it's a Likert measure. So there's 5 options from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Maybe there's only 4 sections and 5 options. I must have got my numbers mixed up, but they're looking really deeply into your supervision relationship in those different areas. You can use the cultural humility scale, firstly, to have clients assess your supervisee for their cultural humility. They fill out information about their background. And then there are 12 questions, again, the Likert measure, 5 options from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Then use the same scale to have supervisees assess themselves for their cultural humility. This is a modified version that you can find. There are 12 questions, and same thing, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So even if I know that there's the argument like, oh, well, self-assessment isn't accurate. Okay, maybe not. However, this can give you a lot of good insights into how your supervisee is feeling about themselves, how they're feeling about their own cultural humility, and can maybe help you to identify some gaps. So let's say that you do the cultural humility scale, have the client fill it out, and then you have the supervisee fill it out about themselves, and then compare the two. They're similar questions, right? They're similar scales. So where is it not matching up? That's going to give you really good insight into what's going on with that supervisee. Some other considerations, just generally here, creating a cultural humility plan. So create a plan collaboratively with your supervisees. Please don't create a plan for them. I know you might come in with some ideas of what would be best for them, maybe some ideas of those activities we talked about, some things they can do outside of session. The main thing here is you want to create it collaboratively with them so they have buy-in into this. You want to also encourage them. Again, you probably know some of what these are. You want to encourage them to identify their own limitations and areas for growth with regard to cultural humility. And then tailor each plan to the supervisee's strengths and weaknesses. Don't have like a cookie cutter plan that you just kind of copy and paste, or that you're like, oh, well, every supervisee does that. That's great and probably not a bad idea. However, each supervisee is going to be very different. They're going to have different goals. They're going to have different limitations. So how can you work with that supervisee to create their own plan and how can you tailor it to their strengths and weaknesses? Like I mentioned, you want to create goals. Not only that, though, you want to create action steps. Put down on paper who is going to do what. An example here might be that the supervisee expands the client populations that they work with. Who's responsible for that? If you have no control over that, then maybe the supervisee is responsible in following up with whomever their boss is, for example. Maybe you do have some control over that, so you need to do something about that. Make sure that you've noted who's supposed to do what and how each thing is supposed to be accomplished. It's really nice to have plans and be like, yeah, someone should do something about that. And then everyone sits there and no one does anything. No, this is a plan that you want to actually put in place. I don't have this up here. If you do know about goals, SMART, SMART goals, that's an acronym that stands for different ways of creating goals. They're specific, they're measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely or time sensitive. So essentially, you can use that to create the goals and see like what's a progress. You have something to compare it against. Some models of supervision you may want to check out. Again, if you haven't had any formal training at all, or it's been a long time, maybe now this is the time. Critical events and supervision model. Let me go back. So critical events in supervision model, this is considered a trans-theoretical approach, so incorporating multiple theories. It looks at the interrelationship between the supervision process and the outcome. It looks at the therapy process and the outcome, and then looks at, as it says here, critical events. So these are what they call, quote, major turning points within supervision process that result in changes for that supervisee. So it might be that question of like pausing and saying, hey, why didn't that client want to shake your hand? Or what was going on in your mind when when your client didn't want to shake your hand? So kind of going two different ways there, right? You've got this event that happened that you have the potential to follow up on, and then you have two different ways of going about it. So that's what this is talking about, those critical incidents where we have choices constantly to do something or nothing in supervision. The heuristic model of non-oppressive interpersonal development. This is where supervisors focus on their own multicultural identity development as well as that of supervisees, and then determining how and when to address topics that in supervision that are potentially culturally sensitive. So kind of incorporating who the supervisee is as far as their worldview, who you are as your own worldview, and then thinking back to that like cultural comfort, not shying away from that, but also figuring out like when and how to do it. And then the synergistic model for multicultural supervision. So looking at both the content and the process within a session and promoting multicultural counselor competence, that's a mouthful, through looking at cognitive complexity, self-reflection, structured interventions. So it kind of leans back towards competence. I think though, hopefully with the knowledge you have from today on cultural humility, you can maybe build on this and take it from competence to cultural humility, from action to application. So just wrapping up here, some resources that I mentioned today: using interpersonal recall and clinical supervision to enhance supervisees' multicultural awareness. This is that list of questions that you can use when reviewing tapes of supervisees. And then cultural humility, measuring openness to culturally diverse clients. That is one of those assessments that you can use. Most of these, if you go to Google Scholar, if you go back and look at like the titles and the authors that I provided today, most of these you can go back and find in Google Scholar and then find like a PDF linked there. So the objectives today that I hope that we accomplished: comparing and contrasting cultural competencies with cultural humility as defined by the CRCC Code of Ethics, incorporating cultural humility into supervision with activities, and assessing your own cultural humility as well as the cultural humility of supervisees. If you need anything from me, please do not hesitate to reach out. You've got my email here, dana@ccresourcing.us. You also have a couple of websites there for me. If you're looking for other trainings or anything, you can go to learn.ccresourcing.us. Regardless, I just love connecting with folks. So if you have questions about this or are looking to connect around like supervision or anything that maybe stood out to you from today, please reach out. I really enjoy hearing from folks. Thank you so much for joining me today. Again, I hope that you're able to apply this in your next supervision session, and I hope to talk with you soon. Thanks so much. Bye.